Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, today we have another great guest. On the line, we have Chris Kettner. He's the host of the Specialist Radio Hour on Stars and Stripes Radio, and he's based out of Virginia. He's the author of the Sales and Management Bible, a Navy veteran, a salesman extraordinaire, frequent public speaker, and on his daily radio show, he covers topics from business to politics to religion. Chris, thank you for joining us.
You're most welcome. Thank you, Franklin, for having me.
Well, I'll tell you what, I think this is going to be a great discussion, and let's start with some things that fall within the intersection of your background in business and sales and your and my coverage of political issues of the day. As you look at the conflict we have in this country between the left and the right and entrenched bureaucrats and those who want to upset the way government has typically operated in the past, and the related issue of extreme aggravation with and opposition to Donald Trump coming from not just the left, but a few more established Republicans or establishment Republicans, a dramatically smaller group than it used to be, by the way. What does your experience in business and sales tell you about those conflicts, why they're happening, and who, if anyone, is more right?
Well, remember one thing, Franklin. I've also been a speech coach for 32 political campaigns. Mm-hmm. So I've been on the inner circle of these things. I've been their debate prep guy, everything but the president and the vice president of the United States, every other position I've done. So there's more than sales and business involved here.
Okay.
There's a lot going on, and a lot of it has to do with corruption.
Okay.
A lot of it has to do with mistakes that our country allowed to happen. For example, it used to be the people would go and serve the country, come back. They would make laws while they were in Congress, come back, and they would live under those same laws. Now they go to Washington. They have a lifetime aspirations. They make laws for us to live under, but not themselves. And that's an example of some of the corruption that has befallen where we are now. Now, once you've got these two people, this divide, it's extremely hard, whether you're salesman of the year, salesman of whatever, it doesn't make any difference. At the end of the day, who wants to give up that kind of power?
Yeah. Well, I think it points to something that it's possible that it was always there and I just didn't recognize it when I was younger. But it seems like the divide between the political class and the rest of the country is much more stark than it used to be. There used to be more of a sense that those in government had a better idea about what life was like for those being governed. And I don't see that anymore.
Well, that's because they're not governing. They're not doing anything. Basically, think about a congressman. He comes into office. He's got a 2-year term. Well, the first year he's learning the ropes. The entire second year he's campaigning.
Yeah.
The entire second year he's campaigning for his next election. So how much governing is he doing?
So do you see?
And I want to say, let me just add, if I could add one more thing. I don't believe it has anything to do with Donald Trump. The vitriol on the left has increased election after election after election. You notice that Al Gore didn't lose that race. The hanging chads caused him to lose it.
Yeah.
Every election that goes on, the vitriol is getting worse and worse. Donald Trump won an election that Hillary Clinton thought she was supposed to win. We could talk about that hours one day. So he happened to be the next victim. It wouldn't have mattered what his name was. The same vitriol, the same hate. They would have just picked on his little quirks, opposed to Donald Trump's quirk, so to speak.
You know, I always like to inject little-known or underappreciated facts whenever a subject comes up, and I think we as a country, there are far too many of those little-known facts because our media does such a poor job of actually speaking the truth, speaking the facts. You're correct that the Democrats have been saying that they didn't lose the election, that Gore actually won. But the reality is that a consortium of newspapers in Florida, and there really are no conservative newspapers. There are ones who are less far to the left, and there are ones who are more far to the left. But there's no real Republican or conservative newspaper down here. A consortium of Florida newspapers went together, and they were able to obtain through Freedom of Information requests the ballot records for that election, and they actually conducted a count of all of the ballots that the Gore team had requested in court when they lost. And you know what they found? And this was shocking and sort of contrary to what I suspect they wanted to find. What they found was that George W. Bush's victory margin increased. It's the exact opposite of what we are told and have been told since 2000 on a regular basis. The margin actually increased when the count that Gore requested was conducted. So it's flat out been shown that he wasn't robbed of his victory. He didn't win. It was unbelievably close, but he lost, and George W. Bush won.
Correct. And we wouldn't hear anything about the Electoral College if Hillary Clinton had won this last election.
Yeah, that's true.
But
yeah.
we wouldn't even be hearing about it. So it's, and anything you hear in the newspapers, almost 90% of the papers are a direct arm of the Democratic Party. There's no way to dispute it, because no one can make up this many lies and say this many untruths day after day after day for all these years and not be part of the situation.
Yeah, in my adult lifetime, I've watched the nature of the news media progress from being biased to the left to being essentially in bed with the Democratic Party to finally being an active participant as the opposition party to the sitting president and the sitting Republicans in Congress. It's a disgrace. I mean, when the press says that they are central to a democracy, or in our case, a constitutional republic, even though they never refer to it that way, they're right. They are critical. They are central, but they are not fulfilling their job. They are supposed to speak truth to power regardless of which side is in power, and instead they've chosen sides.
And they've always been, even back in the day, they leaned left. But Ted Turner changed the game. You see, when the news used to be on when I was a young man, you didn't have time to editorialize. You only had time to give the facts, nothing but the facts. But then when Ted Turner invented 24-hour-a-day news cycle, all of a sudden you had to bring in everyone as an editorial piece. Everybody had to give their opinion because they had to fill 24 hours worth of airtime. Then add all the different cable stations that are doing it, and you've got a mess on your hands. I can count 1,000 lies a night that go on these stations. Fox lies, CNN lies, MSNBC is atrocious. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, I will say one thing about it, and that is both a positive and a negative. And the positive is that there is some real journalism blended in, but there's no way to easily identify it. When you turn on a television or pick up a newspaper as an American, what you've really done is bought a hunting license. And you've now got hundreds of sources out there, and you need to start reading and cross-referencing and trying to get to the truth and trying to figure out when they actually gave you the straight story. And they do sometimes. But the problem is it's incredibly difficult to figure out. And that's actually where I think the role of the podcaster comes in, and in your case, a radio show as well, to try and speak the truth and dig up the information that your listeners are interested in. They may not have the time to look through 50 different sources about a story. They want to be able to look at one, and their ability to do that and get an actual accurate depiction of what happened is a fraction of what it used to be 20 years ago.
Not only that, Franklin, when I hire researchers on my staff to do research for me, because I do a 3-hour show every day, Monday through Friday. Well, it's a lot of research. I have to teach them that the headline means nothing, the first paragraph means nothing, that it's not until you get to about the 6th paragraph before you're going to find the truth. And then I have to teach them after that, okay, now you have to find out who wrote the article. Then you got to look him up and find out where his biases are before you accept it as a real story.
Yep.
I mean, there's so many things that you didn't used to have to do that you have to do now just to get at the truth, like you were saying.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, as much as we get frustrated with social media, you know, Twitter being an example where, you know, everybody sort of goes to the extremes. It serves a function, though, because you have these sort of detectives out there, and if you're very careful about how you read those posts, you can find the ones where they've actually done the real research. And I'll actually compliment them when this happens. They'll pull something out of the memory hole. You forget that a politician said something, you know, 4, 8, 6, 8, 10, 12 years ago, or that the Democratic Party, just how opposed they were to illegal immigration when you go, you know, back into the Clinton years. And before that, you know, at one point, the head of the Congressional Black Caucus, I've forgotten her name, a congresswoman out of Texas, used to do public information spots about the threat of illegal immigration and how it was holding down wages and was bad for African Americans. That was a message coming from the Democrats at one point, and it's been completely abandoned, and the media never reminds us of that fact, and they really should, because it makes the hypocrisy more apparent.
That's absolutely correct. And on top of it, it's just gotten to the point, like, for example, Barack Obama, there must be 40 videos of him saying, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. If you like your plan, you can keep your plan. But what these politicians have learned, and Barack Obama was the best I've ever seen at it, he knew that no matter what he said, the news cycle was going to switch so quickly that he could get away with saying almost anything. And within 2 months, the country was moved on to something completely different.
And when you have what I have always termed a worshipful media when it came to Barack Obama, the odds of being able to get away with that are, you know, hiked even more.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's a worthwhile exercise whenever you see something significant happen in the media that they're either obsessing on or they just very quickly gloss over. If it's misconduct by, more likely by a Democrat, if it's misconduct, they tend to gloss over it. When you see something like that happen, just ask yourself, how would it have been treated if it had been a person on the other side? I mean, look at what Joe Biden did yesterday when he got in the face of that UAW worker, when he cursed at him, referred to him as, you know, using the more graphic term as a horse's behind. It's unclear to me because it's the audio is garbled, but I think he even may have said that he wants to take him outside and slap him, which is unbelievable if that's what he said. I mean, that's evidence of two things. One, an utter disdain for the electorate, and a lack of personal control that may be evidence of potentially the onset of dementia. And there's sort of generalized discussion of it and a little bit more hard treatment from from places like Fox News. But imagine for a moment if Donald Trump had engaged in that kind of personally threatening behavior with a voter, with a member of the general public. You know, he says mean things about the press. He says mean things mocking other politicians. But he doesn't get up in voters' faces and threaten them. I mean, Joe Biden's finger was within inches of this guy's face. And the guy said, you know, that's not right, and waved his hand in front of him. And it was at that moment that Joe Biden talked about wanting to take him outside. I mean, it's astonishing to me that even the CNNs of the world are not pointing out how outrageously inappropriate that is and how it really should call into question whether he's fit for office.
Did you see John Sunua's article yesterday?
No, I didn't.
He used to be chief of staff, I believe,
Yep.
for the H.W.
Yes.
Bush. He wrote a fascinating article. Now listen to this if you want to torque your brain. They've coalesced around Biden purposely, not for the reasons that the normal person would think, but purposely because they don't think he's going to be able to do but maybe a year. He honestly believes that Joe Biden is going to name Hillary Clinton vice president.
Yeah, I've heard that from a couple of people. I also I got a chuckle out of James Woods, the actor's Twitter account, because he said that if named vice president, that Hillary Clinton will attach to his face like the face suckers in the movie Aliens.
Well, I mean, it is a possibility.
It is.
A frightening one, but it is possible. They are that devious.
It is possible, and I've also thought about the possibility that even if it's not Hillary Clinton, that the intent really is to deliver a Democrat president for a longer term. So the intent may be that Joe Biden takes the office, within 2 years resigns, and whoever he names steps up. I actually think there's a very high likelihood that he names Klobuchar. That would result in, if by some chance he were to win, it would result in the first woman president, and it would be a Democrat, and that would be extremely valuable to the Democrat Party.
Sure, and I'll tell you something. I believe, I know this is going back a little bit, but I believe the entire Russian collusion story, I have a theory. I'm not backing down from the theory. I believe Obama knew about all of it, number one. I believe the reason he and Michelle Obama stayed in Washington had nothing to do with the kids' education. I believe they thought Hillary was going to be an easy victory. He was going to use all of that email stuff to blackmail her to make sure she carried out his agenda. So it would be a third and maybe a fourth term of Obama. And the insurance policy was concocted in case a miracle happened and she didn't win. And I think that's why everybody's so crazy and upset, and why all the FBI was involved, the CIA, because this was a real plan to have Barack Obama have a puppet up there to continue with the programs that he had started.
Yeah, I regardless of how extensive the involvement was in the attempt, and regardless of the motivations, I think it's pretty clear, not proven, but it certainly seems like there's substantial evidence that there was something that you could at least argue is the equivalent of a soft coup, that there was an attempt to use the intelligence services in a way that would undermine the incoming president once they realized it was going to be Trump, and that would increase the likelihood that he would lose when the election was yet to come. And that is deeply concerning, and I really don't think enough has been done to uncover that. The best thing that can be said about the ongoing investigation, for example, of the FISA abuse, is that it's still ongoing and you haven't heard a bunch of leaks. That sometimes means that they're doing it right, that they're not conducting.
But they are doing
but
it is a criminal. But
yes.
It is a criminal probe, and we don't know if there's a grand jury been called or not. The guy that's Durham, the guy that's doing the investigation, he has the power to have already called the grand jury, subpoena people, charge them. So I think that's going to be the October surprise.
Yeah, I think the fact that we're not hearing these leaks gives reason to believe that it's being done right. Now, it could be because it's just not being done to the extent we think, and I hope that's not the case. I hope it really is an investigation being conducted as an investigation, which will result in a prosecution if they can put the proof together, and it's not going to be a prosecution by leak, which is what you tended to see under the prior administration.
And think about this, Franklin. Now, this one is another theory, but I'll tell you how I came up with it. I read 60 to 80 articles every night just to get prepared for my show. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, about 2 years ago, I started getting this pop-up. And the pop-up said, would you vote for Michelle Obama if she ran for president? And I got that for 2 years. That pop-up continually popped up on certain articles that I would be doing research on for 2 years. So then I started thinking, now why are they asking that question? Is it possible that for the last 2 years that they've been grooming her secretly, tutoring her on the issues, the foreign affairs, this, that, and the other, and she's the dark horse that all of a sudden comes out if it goes to the convention floor, because she would win automatically probably. First woman, African American, Barack Obama. I mean, it would be almost like it would be tough for Trump to beat her. But why would there be so many ads constantly on my computer? Would you vote for Michelle Obama for president?
I wonder who's funding them. You know, there may have been a political action committee, an interest group that really was pushing that as a possibility and wanted to see what the numbers were, and that would be to the benefit of the Obamas too, because you know, I know she's publicly expressed that she's not interested, but I can't believe she doesn't at least have some interest. And if the numbers came back and showed that it'd be a long shot for her, then maybe that would answer the question for her. But if they came back showing that she had a good shot, then you know that might be what would convince her to step into the race. And if you've done a lot of research, you know, like for example, if you're looking a whole lot at at Daily Kos, The Atlantic, you know, at papers and groups that are on the left, they probably figured you were a Democrat. It's amazing how some of this works on the internet. I remember years ago I was researching a story, and it was covered. An article on it was covered in The Advocate, which is the gay and lesbian sort of public affairs magazine. So yes. I read The Advocate online, and I've been a fisherman almost my entire life. So after I read The Advocate online, it was amazing the ads that I got. You know, it's like gay bass fishing trip. You know, I mean, it was the strangest combination of things. They're like, how do we appeal to this person? So, you know, you wherever you go, it affects those ads that you're going to see, obviously.
Yes, and it could be that, but just the fact that it was on there just gave me pause to think of the possibilities. You know, I don't trust any of the politicians. Period. I don't like any of them. Now, that does not mean all of them are bad. There are some that are there for noble reasons. Trade Audi was one of them. There are some honorable ones, but there are a whole lot of them that are there for self-serving reasons.
I agree, and I know somebody who's very young that I talk to about politics all the time, and one of the things that he says to me is that he trusts congressmen and congresswomen only in their first term. And then after that, he doesn't trust them anymore. But he'll believe what they say for 2 years, and then that's it. I think that's probably overly cynical, but he has a point.
Well, I'm going to tell you this. I mentioned earlier in the show, I've done 32 political campaigns as the speech coach, which puts me in the inner circle, and I do the debate prep as well. And out of the 32, I always ask them before they hire me or when we're negotiating. I say, why are you running? That's one question I ask all of them. All of them but one gave me the same answer.
What's that?
All 31 of them said, I felt compelled. I was asleep last night and I realized my country needed me. I couldn't sleep. I was pacing back and forth. Some similarity to that.
Yeah.
One person said, I want to be a lifetime politician. Now, I was taken back by that answer, didn't say anything. I waited a month or two to digest it, and I wanted to figure out in my mind, what is a lifetime politician? So I watched his voting record, and it became clear to me what a lifetime politician is. It's someone with no conviction. In other words, if the blue people are running, you run blue. If the red people are in charge, you run red. Well, it ended up he did one term and he was thrown out of office. He lost the second election for a big scandal trying to rig the election for his second term in Congress. That's how desperate he wanted to be a lifetime politician.
I
So,
there to varying degrees that was represented on the stage in the Democrat debates. There's one, two, or three of them I think that best exhibit that tendency. I'm curious as to which ones you think are most like that person you're talking about, of the ones that were running for the Democrat nomination when they had the full slate.
okay, well, we can't do all 27 of them.
Yeah, just
but,
two or three that really fit that.
Yeah, but we know Biden is definitely has been a lifetime politician. Bernie Sanders, I really don't believe, even though he's been a lifetime politician, I really believe that he believes the stuff he's saying.
Yeah, and I think he's more extreme than he says he is, but that's something we can
more.
talk about.
Listen,
yeah.
Yeah. Who goes on your honeymoon? Come on, honey. This is our honeymoon. Yay, let's go to my comrades in Moscow.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's grounds for divorce from the get-go.
Yeah, first day I'm out of there.
Yeah.
So those two were easy. Now we go to Beto O'Rourke, lifetime politician.
Yep.
No question about it. He didn't care a hoot about the country. Elizabeth Warren didn't care a hoot about the country. Name some more so I don't have to keep getting.
Well, the one that I think is sort of the prototypical version of that is Pete Buttigieg or Buttigieg.
Lifetime politician.
Yeah, and I really think if you look at his background, he literally it was resume padding. I mean, you served in the Navy, and thank you for your service.
Thank you.
I don't think that what Pete Buttigieg did with going in when he was mayor through a sort of a special form of admittance where he didn't have to go to boot camp. All he did was take the physical and fill out the forms, and he's an officer, and then immediately requested service as soon as possible in Afghanistan. Then he went there and counted every time he went outside the wire driving the MRAP or the Humvee, and then came back and started immediately talking about it on the political trail. He was building a resume.
Yeah, the whole Buttigieg thing. I knew he was a phony. Most of them that pandered. You could see how they pandered so much. And here's what I don't understand: they're pandering to the African American community so much so. I'm thinking, look, they're only 13% of the population. What about the other 87%? Why are you pandering to this 13% of the population so much? Booker's another lifetime politician. He was one.
The thing about the African American community is it's only 13%, but it has a couple of aspects that make it incredibly important to the Democratic Party. One is that it's incredibly loyal. The vote percentages have been up to 95%.
Sure.
That was during Barack Obama's administration. But also they represent a disproportionate number of the voters in certain urban areas with huge numbers of voters. And as a result, the Democrats really cannot afford to lose any significant part of the Democratic Party, which is why they fight tooth and nail against any African-American nominee for office by a Republican, whether it's for the Supreme Court or, for any cabinet level position. They fight like crazy because they don't want to lose the loyal support that they have, even though they're not actually serving that community very well because they haven't been producing the jobs that they've been promising, whereas President Trump, at least so far, has been.
Now, Franklin, you were very kind when you said they haven't been serving their community very well.
Yeah.
You were very kind.
Yeah, I keep waiting
i.e. Baltimore, Chicago.
Yeah. It's interesting. As you look at some of the things that have happened in, the political and social events over the last few years, it was striking to me the difference between the reaction in Baltimore to the Freddie Gray death and the result or the reaction in Charleston, South Carolina, to the church shooting by that insane admitted white supremacist or white nationalist. In Charleston, the black and white communities came together. And I thought, one, it was refreshing, but two, I thought it was evidence of how often we're given the false impression about things by the media, because the impression we always get is that in the South, that's where you're going to find the massive levels of overt racism and blacks and whites in conflict. Look what happened in Charleston. And I think part of it may have been the presence of religion in the mix. One, because it's a more religious town. I mean, Charleston is
Sure.
filled with churches. I mean, perhaps
Sure.
on a per capita basis, it may be the most of any medium-large city in the entire country. But on top of that, the event happened in church. So it made it that much more heart-rending. But also, I think it helped to bring the community together, recognizing that it made it that much more outrageous.
Well, sometime they're going to have to wake up, and I tell them right on the show with no uncertain terms. Look, you're complaining about having been a slave and being in slavery. First of all, there's no race in the entire world that hasn't been a slave to somebody, to another race at one
That's
time or
true.
another in the history of that race. But secondly, you've allowed yourself to go from slavery with chains on you to economic slavery by continually voting Democrat without looking at both sides of the coin.
That's absolutely true. And secondly, I would say there is one aspect of American slavery that made it worse than other slavery, and it's not anything to do with the economic aspects of it. It's not anything to do with product sales or anything like that. That you sometimes hear the sort of blending of capitalism and slavery. That's the pitch that some on the left make that made it worse in America. No, what made it worse was the overwhelming hypocrisy of founding documents for the country talking about all men being created equal, and then having a practice and a policy which is diametrically opposed to that truth. So it was, in fact, incredibly hypocritical, but the country brought itself around, and I think that shows the strength of the country. We fought a civil war to cleanse us of that.
Yes, but people have to remember something, Franklin. We didn't start it. They sold themselves into slavery.
Well, there was an African slave trade within Africa, and there was a slave trade to Britain, and there's still slaves in the world today. It's a horrific practice.
Of course, I'm just saying though that you're exactly right, but we took advantage of what was already happening. And we spent most of at least my lifetime, trying to cleanse ourselves of that and do all kinds of things to make up for it. But it's never going to go away. And everybody, no matter what race you are, I can show you any country you want who enslaved those people. And they're not all complaining still to this day. They're not doing all these. They're not still trying to cleanse themselves. It happened. It's over. Let's move forward.
Yeah, I think, well, if you're in Africa and it does involve two different races, I think that it sort of lends itself less to ongoing conflict once the practice is ended. If you've got a racially based slavery, I think it makes it more difficult to move away from that. I do think, however, that there are people within the country that don't want us to move away from it because it conflicts with their political goals. People like the ones that are pursuing the 1619 project at the New York Times, which is
right.
It's
a business. It's a business.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. There is so much that divides us now that really shouldn't. And you were critical of the news and the cable news, and I think that does it as well. I mean, cable news is always going to go for the story that is the most controversial, the one that is the most likely to cause conflict and divide us, because it's going to put eyeballs in front of the television sets. They're not going to talk about, well, we're getting along well today. Well, that's not really a story that anybody's going to listen to. It's like, yeah, I know. I was just at the grocery store, and, other than now fighting over toilet paper, we're getting along.
But see, and here's what we got to remember. None of the activist groups that are out there today can never end. See, it can't stop. In other words, the Sierra Club, that started to protect the wolves. Now they're into abortion, they're into the LGBT community, they're into the environment. And I watched an interview, and the president said, "Well, look, there wasn't enough money in the wolves." couldn't raise enough, so we had to unify with everybody else. When Harvey Milk was heading up the gay movement, and he got 250,000 followers, all of a sudden he became a dictator, telling the city manager, I'll make sure you don't get elected dog catcher. Well, even when they got the things they wanted, they have to keep adding new things because it's a business and the people up top are making money off of it. What do you think? Al Sharpton, Reverend Jesse Jackson, they never want to see the end to the racial strife. Well, because they're out of business.
Yes, but my one comment would be on that doesn't restrict itself to issues on the left. It doesn't restrict itself to identity politics type issues. That exists with everything. Let's take, for example, government. TVA. I grew up in Tennessee. The Tennessee Valley Authority, once they had dammed up every river they could find, they had to continue to exist. So what did they do? They kept stretching into other issues. They were, like the foremost experts on fertilizer research, crop rotation, and they would set up farms. They would set up research facilities. In the TVA, it had nothing to do with flood control, which is the reason that they were actually established, but they'd already dammed everything up. You look at
That's right. Look at the unions.
The unions. Look at. I watched something, and this will make me seem cold, but I watched something on. I think it might have been. It was C-SPAN. I think about 15 years ago. May have been 12, regarding hunger and the food distribution in America and the prevalence of people who were hungry, and it had changed into food insecure, and the standards that were applied to determine whether you met the threshold were changing over time. And what struck me is, okay, that may be a more accurate way to measure it now. Maybe it's worth discussion. But the bottom line is what they were accomplishing by changing the standard is to constantly demonstrate that all these consultants that were on the stage, that were all nutritional, experts, nutritionists, they all had a continued reason to be employed because the problem was never solved. And I don't think that the problem was larger than it was 20, 30, 40 years before. I think it was dramatically smaller, but they had managed to make it look like there hadn't been that much movement because they kept redefining the definitions.
Yes, and moving the goalposts.
I mean, government does that in the opposite to another extent. I've talked before on the podcast about these ridiculous programs where, like the Promise program in Broward County, where they redefine teenage crime and they never arrest anybody. And then the sheriff stands up and brags about how he's reduced teenage crime. Well, no, you didn't. You just told your people never arrest anybody, so you sort of defined it away.
Isn't that crazy?
That kind of game gets played in by everybody in all different directions, and it actually gets back to my initial question where I talked about your business background and sales background, and what does it tell you about the conflict that we're seeing in government now? And the point I was trying to get to is that we see this very same type of thing in business where the one group will come in and they will try to sort of switch the way things are looked at, switch the standards, try to make themselves look better, and they're in control. And once they become entrenched, if a new player comes into the mix, somebody new at the top, for example, there's an attempt, there's a pushback, a fight that the new CEO, the new head has to deal with because everybody's trying to protect their turf. Well, that same thing happens in government. I just think it happens to an even greater extent because there's an ability in business to, sort of more aggressively cut and to, take more. And there's a profit incentive that results in an overriding control on protecting jurisdictions and bureaucracies. There's more of a constant pressure to cut, and that doesn't exist so much in government. But what we're seeing was predictable when Donald Trump came in. When anybody comes in that is saying, I'm going to upset the establishment, I'm going to change the way things are done, I'm going to downsize, I'm going to rearrange, and actually does things that makes it look like he's really going to do it, I mean, that promotes terror on the other side and everything they can possibly do to try and fight it.
Yeah, it's a mess, and you're exactly right. I've gone into many businesses, Napa for one, just as an example, as a consultant, and there, as soon as I start to try to implement new policies, there's always the pushback from 1, 2, 3 people that have been there forever that don't want to change. It jeopardizes what they think is their job, when really, if they cooperate, they'd have a better job. You
Yeah.
know, if they learn the new way to do it. But the whole country is in a mess right now, and it's all about trying to, I believe, have a one world government. I know people don't like to hear that, but Henry Kissinger testified in 1956 in Congress. I have that paperwork. I have his testimony that we will be a one world government. He's talking about America. It will be a one world government by coercion or by free will. We have no choice in the matter. And he said that in 1956 on the congressional floor to Congress, testifying there will be a one world government.
You know, it's interesting that they teach I wish I had known we were going to talk about this. I probably should have guessed it, but I could have looked it up to be sure on the reference. But there's a concept of planets becoming more and more cohesive or developed. It's considered that when you have a sort of planetary control, you know, at the highest level, that's considered the most developed state. So that pitch that's coming, it exists in the education system and among experts as well that look at societal development, that is eventually going to happen. It sounds like what Henry Kissinger was saying, though, was something that isn't quite as long-term as what those scientists are talking about. They're talking about something that could be 1,000 years away. Sounds like Henry Kissinger was talking about something that might be 100 years away.
Well, he even broke it down to how they were going to do it. I mean, he broke it down to exactly how they were doing it. And if you look at what's happened in the last 30 or 40 years, it's right on schedule. In other words, he said they're going to eliminate the middle class, break the back and the spirit of the working man, so he can't support his family. Get God out of the schools, then get mom and dad out of the schools. Well, what do they want? They already give them free lunch and dinner. Now they want the government to give them free breakfast. Well, the kids are no different, and I'm not saying this in an offensive way, but than any other animal. Whoever feeds them is where they're going to get their most loyalty to. So the parents are going to be out of the picture. And then it's complete indoctrination of our children. The only thing that he didn't have an answer for was how they were going to take our guns away from us. He didn't have an answer for that one. But everything else, he rolled right along with how it was going to happen. And then you've got when I think it was Detroit had that water problem.
Flint.
Flint. They went to NATO to get them to rule on whether they should have to pay water bills and whether they should have to have that water was a basic human right. They didn't. They went to NATO for that.
Tell me, I hadn't heard about the other than when you mentioned it, and you and I talked about this when I talked on your radio show a while ago. The Henry Kissinger statements. Is there a website where people could look those up?
You have to go to the Rockefeller Files. It's called the Rockefeller Files, and it's about I don't know. I think it's 150 pages of nothing but declassified congressional testimony, and it's quite fascinating. But it's called the Rockefeller Files, and some people because they didn't know. They didn't know back in the day. They didn't know that these things were possible. Because America, 50 years ago, America isn't in the place it is today. 30 years ago or 20 years ago, would you think we're actually having people say they're socialist on national television running for president?
No,
Would you?
and one
Would
of
you have thought of that 10 years ago?
No, I wouldn't. And one of the things that most concerns me about Bernie Sanders is he mentions Scandinavian countries that really are not socialist.
None of them are socialists. I've looked into all of them.
What he is really describing is a dramatic expansion of the social safety net, and that's something that should be discussed. What would it be? How could we afford it? Would you have to cut other programs? What kind of tax levels are you talking about? What would that do to investment? Would international businesses choose not to come here? How would it change the cost of living, the standard of living? All of those things are all worthy of discussion. But he wraps it up as a socialist proposal, a democratic socialist proposal. I think the reason that he does that is because his plan is actually for something much worse, something closer to communism. And he's already proposed nationalizing the electrical production, eliminating the utilities, and making it all
the energy. They want control of all the energy.
Because that's the only way they could get what they want with elimination of internal combustion and carbon production and all of that. But the thing is, I think he's being dishonest. I think he wants that socialist name on there so that and he's not going to become president, obviously, now, but if he were to become president, that when he would push for those additional steps beyond what he was describing from these Scandinavian countries, it would seem more normal because, it's socialist. He wants the word out there. He wants to normalize it. He wants to expand the Overton window so it's acceptable, and I think that's what he's up to.
I'll tell you where he made a mistake. His big mistake, and you'll see the polls if you study the polls and Super Tuesday and all of that. He was doing quite well until he started talking about how okay Castro was, and my gosh. We talk about Cuba and we talk about Castro like he's all bad. Did you know the first thing he did was start a literacy program when he took over Cuba? Hello, he didn't start a literacy program. He started an indoctrination program on Marxism and Leninism, and forced them to read that.
Yeah, you're right. And certainly, if nothing else, that cost him Florida. I mean, there's no way he was going to get Florida after that, but it did him serious damage all around the country. I have to admit. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I believe 100% that moment he will regret. I think that was the defining moment. He made it clear to people visually. In other words, he tried to call it democratic socialism to fool everybody. But when he started talking about Castro being okay, I think the people said, wait a minute, this guy really is way off the chain.
Let's leap way forward to kind of wrap up the discussion. What do you see coming? I still believe that Donald Trump will be reelected. I think this coronavirus outbreak, I think the possibility that we may run into a recession because of it makes it much harder for President Trump to win. But I still think he will win. Assuming that he does, what do you see for the presidential election in 2024? Who do you think will come to the forefront, and what do you think the messages will be?
Wow, now that's a pretty heavy question. First of all, you got to get past this one first.
Oh, I know.
And it all depends on what happens in the Congress, in the House of Representatives and the Senate. I mean, that's going to be a big, just because so many things can happen with the Supreme Court.
Yeah, that's true.
If Trump wins, and he'll definitely at least pick one more, maybe two more justices, it could end up being 6-3 conservatives if he wins. If he doesn't win, you got a whole new ball game. They could actually try to stack the Supreme Court.
Yeah, they
Roosevelt
could.
tried it, and it didn't happen. But it could happen today. A lot of things that we never thought could happen, are happening now. So 24, man. I can't even think that far ahead yet. Uh,
Well, I'll
I
throw
mean,
out what I think. I think that we tend to, if a president serves 8 years, we tend to elect someone who is close to being a psychological opposite in some respect. To
yeah,
to
sure.
go from Bill Clinton, who could talk his way out of anything, other than when there were stains on a dress, but he could talk his way
Right.
out of anything. And then to follow him with George W. Bush, who was the guy would be fun to have a beer with, but he was sort of a backslapping good old boy, could not communicate anywhere near as well as Clinton could. And then, so that's a sort of a fundamental change in the psychological nature, the personality between the two of them. And then you go from him, the backslapping good old boy, to Obama, who is and was more like the calm professorial type. And then you go from him to the brash businessman dripping with braggadocio, as I always describe him. They're sort of opposites. And what's interesting to me is that Biden is running now. He's claiming that he's a unifier. And I think what he's doing is he's basically making the pitch that will be made in 2024. Maybe what he's figuring is that Donald Trump is such an overwhelmingly strong personality that the country will be tired of him in 4 years the way that we're typically tired of a president in 8 years. So he's going to take that shot. Now, there's two things wrong with that. One, it is only 4 years, so I think the odds are we will be able to take another 4 years of Donald Trump, and I think he will continue to succeed quite well. And then in 8 years, we're going to want somebody different, and that's when that unifier message is really going to bear fruit. But the second thing is, Joe Biden is the worst person to be preaching the unifier message because of the way he responds to voters. He's not a unifier. If you challenge him, he basically threatens to beat you up and take you out in the alleyway. I mean, and it's amazing that he's still doing it. If he didn't have Secret Service protection, I don't even want to think about what might happen. He's just amazingly aggressive whenever somebody questions him. I've never seen a politician quite like that has risen to that level.
Here's two foods of thought for you. Think about these two things. One, what is the coronavirus impact on how they campaign, debate, rally, or any of that from now till election day? How is that going to affect it? That's a huge thing to think about.
I think it hurts President Trump because he relies so much on rallies.
It may hurt him. It may hurt him. But it may end in 2 months and everybody goes back to normal. We don't know. But that's something that we have to take into consideration for sure. And then the second thing we have to think about is what happens if Joe Biden does somehow win.
Yeah, I think you may be right that he could be a short-term president and then his vice president takes office, which if people think that's coming, as long as it's not Hillary, it actually might help him. So, I mean, I really do want President Trump to get reelected. I do think that's the best thing for the country. And I also think it's the best thing for the Democratic Party because it would force them to get their left under control. They've moved way too far to the left, and they need to move back more in the direction that Bill Clinton had them. And I think losing badly would help spur that.
Well, I would like to see us get the House back, increase the Senate by a couple, and keep Trump. To me, that would be a great election night.
That would be a glorious election night. So I'll tell you what.
Hey, Franklin, before I leave, can I identify my station and
absolutely
let everybody know when I'm on?
That was what I was going to say. Is two things. One, is there anything I've asked you that I should have, that you think I should have, that you wanted to mention? And secondly, talk for a moment about where people can reach you and what they can find.
Okay. No, I think I've had a blast. It was great talking to you, Franklin. Thank you for the honor of being on your show. I'm on Stars and Stripes National Radio from 9 till 12, Monday through Friday. It's political most of the time. Definitely the first hour. Second and third hour, I have national and local guests from all over the world. And so Monday through Friday, they can just all they have to do is look up starsandstripesradio.com, and they can find all the information they need.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you for joining us today. I really enjoyed the conversation. It sounds like you did as well. And I look forward to talking with you again in the future.
All right, Franklin, you got it, buddy. Take care.
All right, you too. Bye.
All right, bye-bye.
What a great discussion. We'll be back next week with another fantastic episode for your enjoyment. Be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits, and follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. The Political Spirits website is up and running. You'll find it at political-spirits.com. And it's up to date now. We've been running a little bit behind, a week or two, but not anymore. It's up to date. You'll find cover pages for each new audio episode. My bio is also on the website as well, and there are links to world news stories of interest and related articles, and a discussion forum is coming soon. Incidentally, you'll also find the 11 maxims of political spirits. Be sure to subscribe to the website. There's a lot of content there. And we're on Instagram now as well at Political Spirits. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube also, and the YouTube channel is called Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.